parking, parking lot landscaping, and streetscape. Ms. Petcack.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. This is a request by Councilmember Majdi in April of 2017 after, and this is prior to my hiring as the director under the former director. Going back even before that, there was work sessions and discussions with the Planning Commission and Council about some changes to the parking standards in Chapter 18. And so a number of amendments were brought forward to the Council. The two biggest items that were not approved by Council included reducing the parking standard for commercial buildings from 1 to 200 to 1 to 250, and adding a requirement for landscaping in surface parking lots. A couple things. We park commercial buildings at a straight rate of 1 per 200, with the exception of restaurants, which we park based on seats, 1 parking space per 4 seats, and a couple other commercial uses of which we do not have those uses in town, specifically bowling alleys, theaters, and indoor skating arenas. But generally, for all of our commercial uses, we park it at a 1 per 200. The idea that that was not the appropriate parking rate for commercial was first suggested by the consultants as part of the MAC committee and the work that came out of and the development of the Maple Avenue commercial zone. My concern with just going to a straight, changing the 1 per 200 to 1 per 250 is that it does not take into consideration different commercial uses. And as part of the zoning update, we will be looking fresh at not only the land uses that we allow in our commercial zones, but also the appropriate parking standards for those various land uses, as well as other provisions such as shared parking. My concern with any change to the parking standard for commercial buildings is that, one, I don't know if that parking standard is appropriate. Grocery stores, convenience stores like Wawa have different trip generations and turnovers compared to a retail store or an office development. So while it may be appropriate for a 1 to 250 or 1 to 300 ratio for the latter, retail stores and office, I would be concerned with changing all commercial buildings and having that include grocery stores and convenience stores and the like. The second thing is, if we do make a change now, and then we go through the zoning update, and we make another change in 2 years, it's going to be onerous on staff to enforce 2 different sets of parking standards. If something comes in the interim and is approved at a different ratio to what we end up with. And then finally, I will also say that there is a provision in place right now in the zoning code if an applicant, a property owner comes in and wants to redevelop their property and they feel that the parking standard, the 1 per 200 or even the 1 per 4 seats for a restaurant does not make sense for their property based on other uses there, they can request a modification of requirements for parking. And that we have a recent example of that with the Bear Branch Tavern, which came in, they're in the former Cardinal Bank space in an office building, and they made the case that we do require the 1 per 4 for not only indoor restaurant use, but also outdoor. Most jurisdictions reduce that for the outdoor spaces. So they made a case that they had gone to the condo board because those other uses did not have the same peak periods as the restaurant use, and they had agreement from the condo board that it was appropriate to kind of reduce their parking standard, which the council, after a recommendation from the Planning Commission, approved. So I would say my professional recommendation is that we look fresh and comprehensively at all of our parking standards as they relate to uses and identify what, more specifically than what we have right now, generalized for the appropriate parking for various commercial uses going forward as part of the zoning update. And we can talk I was planning on talking in more detail about that at our September 9th work session on the scope proposed for the zoning and subdivision ordinance update.
Okay. So questions for Ms. Petcack? Councilman Majdi?
Thanks. Yeah, the first question would be, you mentioned, in a couple of years. What is that timeline that you're referring to? And, yeah, let's just start there. What is that timeline that you're referring to?
So again, at the September 9th work session, I will have a draft scope for the council to review and provide a comment on. Working right now with the finance department on developing the RFP. We could have the RFP out following on that September 9th work session by late September. Turnaround times for review and submittal and everything should get us to a notice to award early January of next year. I've been involved in 2 processes to rewrite zoning ordinances. It's normally a 1.5-year process. I would say a 1.5 to 2 years to provide ample opportunity for public engagement in that process. So if we kicked it off in January of 2020, by the end of 2021, we should have an updated zoning and subdivision ordinance.
Sorry, so that would be for not just the parking. Parking would be part of it, but it would include all
Everything.
aspects. So it would be a review of code sections 17 and 18, correct?
Chapter 17 and 18.
Okay. And just for background for everyone, I just wanted to let everyone know that in the budget, planning and zoning staff came to us in the spring of 2018, and we funded half of the code review and update in 2018, 2019, and then the other half in 2019, 2020. So we would have a consultant, and so there could be public outreach, and there was monies available to actually do the entire, zoning or code review and update. Correct. Just as an FYI for anyone.
Our code is turning 50 this year, and while there have been obviously new zone districts added, the Maple Avenue commercial zone in 2014 and the Church Street Vision in the early 2000s, most of the provisions from the code not only are from 1969, they actually are carryovers from the 1956 code. And so, and I use this analogy all the time, we're driving around a 1969 state-of-the-art station wagon, and there have been advances in automobiles, just as there have been advances in zoning updates, in zoning codes. And codes now are written so that, no disrespect to our town attorney, but so that people other than land use attorneys can understand and read them. So they include a lot of charts, simple language, tables, illustrations. They're organized in a way so that all like things are together. Use tables, parking standards, and the such. So our update will be looking at just not only the organization, but making sure that our uses reflect modern uses. We have uses, well, we have a catch-all land use for our commercial zones called general business enterprise consisting of sales. And that pretty much captures everything, just like we have a parking standard for commercial buildings. So we want to, again, look fresh, look anew, and look comprehensively at what we desire as a town, what we've laid out in our comprehensive plan is our vision, and make sure the zoning achieves that vision.
Thank you. Questions? Councilwoman Patel, and then Councilman. No, Councilwoman Patel, and then Springsteen.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So I agree that definitely need to update the code in general since it is that old. I just had a question about where does the updating of the MAC zoning fall into that timeline? Is that to be done prior to doing the entire code, or is that incorporated in your general timeline? How have you prioritized that?
So again, discussed this at the September 9th work session, but the recommendation from staff would be to include all the information that staff has done on amendments to the MAC and include that in the comprehensive review of the zoning ordinance. Councilmember Noble can speak to this as chair of the MAC, the committee for Maple Avenue. There are different approaches that we can use in achieving the vision for Maple Avenue. My concern with just amending the MAC is that, and this is common across the country, a lot of times if a zone isn't working or achieving the results desired by a community, they write it and create a new zone district. And so there are some limitations with our underlying commercial zones that I think it would behoove us to take a look at those. And maybe there's a way to make some adjustments to the underlying commercial zones and maybe even simplify the commercial zones. We have 3 commercial zones along Maple Avenue. And the difference in those zones is really about the uses that are allowed. We may be able to have just 1 commercial zone for Maple Avenue or 2 and target where the incentive, if we desire to have an incentive for an additional story to, what is historically the downtown. So there's an opportunity in hiring a consultant, and we'll talk about this in the work session, but the key, when we hire a consultant, we want to make sure we hire somebody who not only are planners, but land use attorneys, because this is a legal instrument, but who have experience working in Virginia, understand Virginia state code, but have also worked other places and can provide some options for how we can, again, going back to the vision, going back to the comprehensive plan, achieve what we so desire here in town.
Councilwoman Patel, do you have any other questions?
I mean, I guess my only concern with doing it in that fashion is that, we've kind of heard a lot of dislike or non-approval, I should say, for the MAC zoning, which is on a moratorium. That moratorium is up November 15th.
Correct.
If we decide to redo the MAC zoning in conjunction with the entire commercial zone, and you're saying that's going to take 2 years, well, I think that that's really kind of putting the brakes on development in general. I think it would be nice to incorporate some early changes into the MAC codes and then continue to work on that, because it's a process. I don't think it's, we write the code and then it's set in stone. It is a process, as we've learned over the past few years. So I just kind of would love to see the MAC prioritized a little bit more so that it's not drawn out over a 2-year period. I understand that these need to be done, hand in hand, side by side, but potentially, just kind of focusing on that aspect of the code and then moving to the by right commercial code and then whatever else needs to be updated would be my personal preference.
And if the council desires for us to do that, we can. I will say we are a small staff. So if we want to work on the amendments to the MAC, we got those to a pretty good place with the Planning Commission, but we still have quite a bit of work to do on the design guidelines. And from a staffing perspective, we are also in the process of implementing the electronic plan review software. So we can get back to work and continue on the MAC. It would just delay the start of the zoning update.
So one thing, Councilwoman Patel, that I agree with you. Based on what we saw, there was things people liked about the Maple MAC and things people did not like about the MAC. Hence the reason for the moratorium, and hence some of the things that Councilman Maggi was trying to bring forward in the by right. Those are some aspects of the MAC, the streetscape, et cetera. But I think what Ms. Petcack, based on what she's saying, is we can hopefully make those updates. Granted, it'll take a little bit longer than planned, but it'll help us look at the whole zone to see, okay, what is not working in general, because even when we talked about the MAC, we didn't think everything would redevelop under that. There's lots of other zones and other covenants in the town that can't allow for the MAC to redevelop because you can't bring the streetscape up. So it gives us more of a holistic and comprehensive look at it. And so if we change parking, how does that influence it? If we allow mixed use even under by right, what does that do? Because if you have just one use, the parking may stay at 1 to 200. If you have multiple uses, it might change. So it allows us, I think, to kind of look at it a little more holistically and make sure the entire corridor is available for whether someone wants to redevelop or just want to reface or want to leave it exactly the way it is and redo something within there and repurpose or restore. So it might give us a few more opportunities to do that. And the nice thing is, too, is my understanding, and I know Ms. Petcack, you're going to talk more about this on September 9th, but you're going to try to get input from the community up front so they have input into it, not just feedback from it. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that's part of learning from this process, I think, through the MAC process as well. So just something else to think about. Councilman Springsteen, then we'll go back to Ms. Patel.
Just before I just talk about this, kind of an editorial comment, is the MAC, while we have issues, I think it was envisioned only about 38% of the properties would qualify to do that. Yet we've had our transportation folks come here, and then we had the architect from the county saying, well, the gas station is going to go, we're going to do that. I think this assumption that every building in Vienna is going to be redeveloped is just not going to happen. And I was honestly a little taken aback when she said, well, I'm sure the gas station is going to be redeveloped, and the new road we're going to put by Branch, that's all going to go. I'm like, I don't think that's going to happen. And I still look at the MAC as, only certain products qualify. I am a little concerned. I'm sympathetic. It's a two-year process. It's a real big piece. I would just like to see if we could do something to move the MAC along and at least address the stuff, because clearly people were upset about the MAC, but people understood that we needed the MAP. So I would like to maybe focus on both the MAC, or somehow the MAC and the commercial area to keep things, things viable. But that's just my opinion. I'll see what everyone else thinks.
Councilwoman Colbert, and then we'll go back to Patel. Sorry.
Thanks. I agree. I think we do need to look at this as a whole. And I do think that, changing one thing might affect something else. And so we need to keep all that in mind. And I think that we need to remember how long it took for the MAC to be developed. And I'm looking at you, Councilmember Noble, because you were a big part of that. And so, that was over a decade.
It took a long time, just the piece we were doing.
That was right.
Not
I think
going
my
back to
mother
the original committee in
appointed you
2000.
onto that, right. So I think 2 years, as I know we want to get things moving along, and I appreciate that thought. And I don't know if that's, maybe Councilman Maggi can explain if that's what he's kind of getting at, is let's get things moving along, which I totally appreciate. But I think when you think of 2 years out of how long it's taken to get this far, and then all the concerns that our residents have and that we have and the Planning Commission, it doesn't seem like that much when you kind of put it in perspective like that. Thanks.
Okay. Councilwoman Patel.
So I think that the whole concept of creating more options for development is fabulous. I think that that's definitely the direction that we need to go on. So I don't underestimate or de-emphasize the importance of having that process occur. I guess my concern, again, is that, you have to start somewhere. And I personally would love to see them starting with the MAC. There is an excellent framework for the MAC, if you ask me, and there were some changes that were obvious, to me at least, about what needs to be changed in the MAC. So I think even just initially proposing those types of changes, just to kind of continue the process, get it moving along, and making sure that we're getting a glimpse of it along the way, and able to kind of give feedback, and maybe even our own recommendations to that process. I think that would, again, it would help. It would help in terms of not putting a 2-year hold on development, because right now it seems like if we just waited the full 2 years before we proposed anything, then anybody who was even interested in coming in and developing would wait to see what we came up with, as opposed to if we can kind of move the process along and say, well, we've looked at everything, we've modified the MAC, and this is what we've done to modify it. So this is an option until we catch up with the regular commercial code. So I just emphasize that, everything has to get done, and, in what order are we doing it is something that I'm concerned about, and I'd like to see the MAC addressed first, and I don't think I'd want to see it put on hold for 2 years while we're waiting to do everything.
Sure. One thing to also be aware is if we were to do changes with MAC, which actually was our original intention, was to continue doing that. And now it's come up to the point where we can start the code review and update. But then we'd look through the MAC again, because the MAC is part of Chapter 18. So it would be something that would be then reviewed again in the next few years. But I understand what you're saying.
Like
yes.
Process,
Yeah, absolutely. Councilman Potter.
Well, I don't think that the code rewrite should preempt the MAC reform. You've put a lot of work into it in terms of recommended changes, and have submitted those, and now just to put those on a shelf for a while and focus on the codes in general, I think it naturally would take longer. I'm wondering if you compare MAC with with other codes to identify differences and then deal with those differences instead. It would seem much shorter in terms of being able to make a decision on the MAC. If the decision is it's not workable and we need something else, we should admit it and move on. But otherwise, I think we need to keep MAC on the top of the pile and continue with where you were with your rewording that you were working on for the MAC. My sense.
Councilman Majdi.
Go ahead, go, I'll see.
I'll cede to Mr. Payton.
Well, I was actually, whichever
Okay, you're going to wait,
order.
Mr. Payton?
Why don't you go ahead, then I go, then Mr. Payton
Okay,
go.
Mr.
I had a
Councilman
question
Majdi,
for
you guys are
Mr.
all very,
Payton,
very
actually. So
polite.
if he
so-
has a statement that answers my question, that would negate the need for my question.
Mr. Payton, do you have anything to say?
Madam Mayor, members of the Town Council, clearly, town staff will move in the direction that the council gives us regarding the MAC, as well as the zoning rewrite, as far as Chapter 17 and 18 are concerned. One thing that we may want to consider is that addressing the MAC now, going forward. So right now, we're at the end of August. And so I guess to look at that, that task, I think is something that would probably take us into next year, I would imagine, from a timeline standpoint. I think that certainly there's been work done, but I think that there's also ideas that 7 council members here have with regard to what the MAC should look like if the moratorium were to be lifted. And then there'd be a community engagement piece of some sort. And I'm thinking ahead that it may be into next year, next summer or so, before there may be something that this council would vote on, and that might actually be aggressive if we're having community outreach and all that needs to go into revising the MAC. There may be aspects of the MAC that haven't even been thought of, that when you start kind of, peeling it back and saying, well, let's change this, let's change that, and then getting a consensus around that may take some time. And so I'm just, want to just advance the idea and thought that 2 years may seem like a long time, but it may not be as long as we think if we look at it from the standpoint of addressing the MAC and making those changes, addressing the zoning code as well as the MAC together. The time may not be that different as far as getting the work done, is what I'm thinking. I just wanted to offer that
Okay.
idea.
Thank you, Town Manager. Councilman Majdi, did you have anything? That answers your question? Okay, good. Councilman Noble.
This is going to be a little long. I was the MAC committee chairman. Everybody knows that. Some people appreciate that, some don't. I liken the current MAC framework to a really great, pretty screened porch attached to a dilapidated house that might be 50 years old. And, the feedback we have now is that there's a lot of other moving parts with the MAC code. I'm actually kind of disheartened right now in terms of what we really do need to do, because ultimately the initial conversations in our steering committee were about Maple Avenue. They weren't about a piece of code. And so the purpose and intent is about Maple Avenue. And I think we need to take a step back and look at Maple Avenue and commercial and the rest of the town for that matter, because it's a set of interrelated topics, as Ms. Petkakis said. Even Mr. Majdi's 13-page piece that we provided at the work session isn't just about commercial, isn't just about MAC. It's about transitional housing, different types of zones. These are all moving parts associated with Maple Avenue, not MAC. And those things are interrelated. For example, we brought up this idea of parking going from 1 to 200 to 1 to 250, which is increasing the parking ratio, but by doing that, it's reducing the number of parking spaces. by right. And many people here say, we don't have enough parking, even though we're trying to work on parking garages. But then the parking in the MAC code is a discount off of those numbers, which increases a higher parking ratio, which means even less parking because ostensibly there's mixed use and walking and those other things going on. So, there are a lot of moving parts to this. The other piece of the puzzle, which Ms. Petcock was getting to, is since our code was written, there has been a significant amount of research in how people engage in activities in terms of parking and what those requirements are for parking, not necessarily code numbers, but what people actually do, and with chip generation for how those activities in terms of both vehicles and people coming in and out of different types, very discrete different types of business establishments, not retail generically, but fitness center specifically. And we had the opportunity in a code update to address those particular items because there's real data behind them now, not just some abject conjecture. The other thing is that there's and a number of that stuff's been updated even as recently as a couple of the major documents have been updated within the last 2 years, which means that we can take advantage of that. I do agree with Mr. Payton that our timelines may not be that different once we get through this because of all the different public engagement things. And let's see, where's my next note here? Where am I going with this? I lost track of my notes. And the other thing is, to be honest, if we're just looking at MAC or just the individual items that Councilman Majdi suggested, we're playing around the edges. We're not. One of my biggest frustrations, I think one of the biggest frustrations with the whole Maple Avenue process from 2000 was that we're playing around the edges. Let's look at the goals and objectives for our town. Let's solve the problem. Maybe I'm too much of an engineer in terms of dealing with this. We have the opportunity to solve the problem. The problem is our zoning code. The problem is the interrelated nature of the things we want to achieve. And the point that Ms. Petcock made about we do an amendment now, and then 2 years later we amend it again, and we got two different sets of code pieces and things that are non-conforming and stuff like that. Why would we do that to our staff? The other thing is, in terms of the value for our taxpayers, why would we update the MAC code when then we go back and do the comprehensive zoning code update and update the MAC code again? That's a waste of town resources, which to me makes absolutely no sense. So my strong suggestion is Ms. Petcock's coming back with a statement of work. We expeditiously as possible move that forward. And we have these conversations. And we have these conversations with the community. And that's, I believe, the intent that how, instead of a committee, which had all these public meetings and no one really was interested, even though it was in the town newsletter, we have these workshops like we do with the Maple Avenue thing. We bring people in and have the conversation. So everybody knows how these interrelated moving parts work. And the other thing, and this is the other point I wanted to make, is our planning commissioners and ourselves, being on planning commission, a number of others have been planning commission, we earnestly work and try to be knowledgeable about the code. I have a little more expertise on the traffic side of things, but I'm not a professional planner. And while we have 2 professional planners on staff who can administer and provide oversight to this, some of this stuff is in the weed stuff. It's in the law. It's in detailed analysis stuff. We need professional support. We can't just ad hoc this through a bunch of community meetings. I wouldn't ask any one of you in your professions to do that. Why should we ask Cindy to do that, Ms. Petcock to do that? So for my part, I would want to do 2 things. One, as expeditiously as possible, and I don't know exactly how fast that is, but I'd really love to award something before January, preferably in November, assuming all the timelines that Ms. Surface is reacting to me about out there, and get this award as soon as possible and get ourselves underway. And the other thing I would suggest, and I would like to consider tonight or at our next meeting, is adding to the agenda direction to the Planning Commission to extend the current moratorium on MAC until whatever time frame that Ms. Petcock gives us for it being done. Now, I know there's folks in our business community and development community that may not be happy with this. But you know what? They'll probably be a lot happier with something where they don't see the ground shifting underneath them during an approval process, which is completely unfair to them. And so having a level of certainty in terms of development, even though we're going to place a hold on it for 18 months, is a far better outcome downstream for the long-term vision of our community than for the near-term, let's just get this fixed because we did so much work on it. So that's my piece. Apologize for the long-windedness, but I feel very passionately about this. And I think that we need to take a long-term view of what is the highest value to the community in terms of engaging them and moving everything forward that's necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Noble. Councilman Majdi.
Thanks. First, I just want to clarify that I don't want to preclude or supplant the coming work session. Sounds like we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff in a few weeks, and that's good. It also sounds like we need to discuss the schedule more during that work session. It sounds like that's part of the agenda. I'm hearing a lot of different opinions there. So that'll be an interesting discussion. I do hear a lot of common ground here. There are a few areas where we can agree. First, just a quick question that, well, there are a few, I hear a lot of common ground. I see and hear a few areas where we agree. I do notice that there might be some areas of disagreement. I just want to clarify where we are. So I put thoughts out there via a memorandum. Is that on the list of things that's being considered for updates to the code? I don't know how this is working, and that's not really clear. So there might be a bit of a miscommunication or a lack of communication about what is on the list of things that's being considered. And I would add to that, we've got 2 new council members. I'd like to hear what their thoughts are on what should be considered for revisions.
And Councilman Mazza, we also have the old list from back when we were like prioritizing
Right.
updates way back.
So are we talking about an old list, a new list, a medium list, a developing list?
Thank you for the question, Councilman Majdi. I believe Ms. Petkat could answer that, and I know we are preempting a little bit, but let's have her answer that so we can find what's going on. My understanding is it's all of Chapter 17 and 18, which means
Correct.
everything's being reviewed.
correct.
Parking, all the different zones, and correct me if I'm wrong, and please add to this. The MAC is obviously part of Chapter 18. Some divisions is 17, zoning is 18. So all of those sections, signs that we talked about, there's lighting that's in Chapter 4, but things that could be added to our industrial zone and other zones. So design standards. So Ms. Petkat, please speak. Please share.
Like we're doing a big spoiler alert on the work session. So we will talk about.
It might be a very quick work session. We don't know.
The scope of services that I've drafted up identifies not only the process, but also what we expect coming out. And so in terms of organization, we'll be looking at our zone districts. If there is an opportunity to consolidate some zone districts, I mentioned earlier, I think I shared with you back in 56, originally we only had 2 commercial zone districts, and we've added commercial zones as we've wanted to add uses. And there's other approaches to that now. You can simplify your commercial zones and then identify if use is permitted or are conditional use or a special use. But we'll be looking at our zone districts. We'll be looking at all uses in those zone districts. You can standards are either dimensional standards, so that's height, setbacks, lot coverage, things like that, and then development standards pretty much captures everything else. So we currently do not have lighting standards for any zone outside the MAC. Landscaping standards, our sign ordinance is very much in need of updating. We need to make sure that we're consistent with recent Supreme Court decisions. So signs, all of those, what I would quantify or qualify as development standards will be addressed. We'll also lay out, there'll be a whole section on decision makers and processes. Questions about, are we in compliance with state code? We'll make sure that we'll have charts that'll show, and flow charts and tables, if this is a rezoning, what requirements are there for public notification, for notification to neighbors, all that'll be outlined, and we'll have a chapter or subsection just for definitions. So we currently, I say this all the time, the code is silent on a lot of things. We don't define key terms. We don't define key uses. We don't have parking standards for key uses. So all of that will be on the table. And again, the number 1 and number 2 implementation recommendations from the comprehensive plan were to update Chapter 17 and update Chapter 18, the subdivision ordinance and the zoning ordinance. So everything we do needs to then go back and be in compliance with our comprehensive plan. But I've identified some goals that I would like to discuss with you, but I think based on what's in the comprehensive plan, we'd like to see come out of this process, and that's really the whole point of the work session on the 9th, is to talk about that.
Thanks. Can I make some more
Councilman
comments?
Majdi, and then
Great.
Town Manager.
For me, I'm not interested in Chapter 17 updates right now. I understand that there's a trade-off. I mean, if you consider everything holistically, there's benefits to that, and there's drawbacks to that. The trade-off is,
We're not in compliance with state code on Chapter 17 for our subdivision ordinance. And it is commonplace when you do an update that you combine, you look at both your subdivision and your zoning ordinance together, because obviously the zoning has implications for any kind of subdivision.
right, and one of the drawbacks is that it slows down work for Chapter 18, which has, it
It's,
doesn't?
no, so in the 2 previous processes that I've been involved in updating, and I will say, in prior jurisdiction where I worked, we did a unified development code, which is not just Chapter 17, it's not just zoning and subdivision, it is all development-related ordinances in the code brought into one document. I mean, it was a huge undertaking, and we did that in a year and a half. We had form-based codes for all of our commercial zones. We had updates to all the rest of our zoning ordinance. So, but the work isn't, it's set up in modules. It's usually like 3 or 4 modules to update the code. And I liken it to the Sesame Street approach. All like things are discussed together. So we discuss all zone districts together, and we discuss what our options are and what changes we want to make, and we get feedback on that. We have stakeholder meetings, community meetings, and once there's agreement, we kind of set that aside and we work on the next module, and that might be all of the uses and related development standards. And so it's broken into manageable chunks, and all like things are discussed together. But not including Chapter 17 would be a huge disservice to the work we're doing. And that's what the contract will include. That's pretty much the standard approach that every jurisdiction takes when they go through a major update like this, is to combine both subdivision and zoning together.
But Chapter 17 governs, just for everybody's understanding, it covers the residential sectors in town,
It's subdivisions, our subdivision ordinance.
only subdivisions.
Correct.
And those can be in the residential sectors in town.
Right, it's related to the residential zone districts in Chapter 18, but it is a separate ordinance in our code. We have Chapter 17 is subdivision, Chapter 18 is our zoning.
Okay. So a few thoughts that I had. May I go ahead?
Please.
Thanks. I think that we should explore, well, I think we have a lot of common ground. Let me just repeat that. I think that we should explore the use of effective dates. That would allow us to do work in chunks, like you just said, or modules. So we could talk about a module or a chunk, potentially, pass it, but have it be effective later, and then bring everything online at the same time, which would address some of the points that you're making, that everything's interrelated.
So Chapter 18 is one code. Everything is interrelated to other sections. You do not approve one section. It would be like approving the budget and only approving planning and zoning's budget, but nobody else's budget. It is the whole budget. You approve the whole budget. The same for the zoning ordinance. It is one document. We review, we break it into manageable chunks to review it and understand it and provide comment and feedback, but it's an up or down vote on the entire ordinance.
Respectfully, it doesn't have to be done that way, and
It-
we've made many
it does.
amendments. We've made many amendments to the code in the past.
One-offs,
I can give
little
you multiple
changes,
examples.
which had implications in other sections that we did not address. We run into this all the time, where
Right.
we've made changes to the MAC, and we did not carry some of those changes through to other sections of the code that are influenced or implicated by those changes.
Right. Well, it sounds like we're going to have a lot to talk about at the work session. Here are some points to consider. First, for this agenda item, my intent was to add one idea to a large set of ideas that we could discuss. It's not to preclude other ideas from being discussed. That's the opposite of what I was hoping for. And in fact, at the beginning of this presentation, you talked about a totally different way to look at parking, which is by creating different uses. And I think that's a terrific idea. Hasn't been fleshed out yet, but already my inclination is that that would be a better way of doing things. So the intent of this agenda item is just to add one idea for discussion, not to preclude an idea like you're coming, like you just mentioned earlier. And I hope that that you feel empowered to look at all different types of ways to incentivize development in the town. And I'm hearing some common ground that all around the council, people are interested in incentivizing development in the commercial sector. I don't speak for everybody, but that sounds like a decent summary of some of the comments that have been made. I just wanted to make a couple points here. I'll run through it quickly. Mac Streetscape is popular. People want sidewalks. They want wide sidewalks. They like cafe seating and buildings fronting Maple Avenue. These are consensus good things for the town. Small business owners deserve a chance to redevelop just as much as big developers do. We need to move beyond the 60s strip mall style. This should be required throughout the town, not just for Mac applications. Perhaps there's different ways to require it or not require it, or to engender it, bring it about. And I'd love to hear more thoughts from your department on that. No more sea of asphalt, if you will, parking lots. We need to require landscaping. One way or another, we want redevelopment on Maple Avenue. This idea gives us one option. There hopefully will be many. These concepts, when I say these concepts, I'm referring to the concepts that I laid out first orally at our June 17th meeting, then again at our July 1st meeting, and in writing to the council, which I assume was included in the record. I asked it to be included in the record. So these concepts have been vetted and discussed. There's draft language already written, and I'd love to hear what our current planning and zoning department thinks about it, what everybody thinks about it, and then also we have 2 new council members to hear what they think about it. And I'd also just like to note, as Councilman Noble alluded to earlier, the MAC Steering Committee recommended that changes be made to the regular commercial code, the C, C1, C1A, C1B. So this is not a brand new concept or out of nowhere, out of left field. And I also wanted to comment on why this agenda item would be timely. One, it affects the MAC streetscape under, as you mentioned, Councilman Noble, the MAC streetscape under the regular commercial code redevelopment affects the MAC streetscape development under the MAC. The same thing can be said for parking lots and parking requirements. At a minimum, the way I see it, this is just about doing your homework and considering all options and seeing what's out there, because, as you said, they're all interrelated. I think I said earlier, but just want to reiterate that there's no intention to replace or supplant the coming work session. All I'm was hoping to do was add one idea for consideration among many, and to, I think, give staff a sense of the council's priority. The other thing I would mention is that we're already discussing many related issues to streetscape, as evidenced by the meeting, the work session earlier today on mobility. Streetscape is under consideration right now, so this is good timing, the way I look at it. And we have new staff. I'd like to hear what they have to say. In my opinion, our citizens want redevelopment. Nobody wants stagnation. We want growth, but we want it to be the right size and scale. And that's in debate. And this is one way, among many, to tackle that issue head on. It's the biggest issue in town, in my view. And another thing is, this is a little bit different from how we typically do business by voting on a directive to staff. That's uncommon. And one of the benefits of that, in my view, is that by voting on the record that improves transparency. Our citizens can look at what people said on the record. It's easier to look up the record from council meetings than it is from work sessions. And it allows us, the council, to demonstrate to our citizens that we want to look at these ideas for redevelopment. If we have a work session and it goes on, and there's no statement on the record from council members, from the perspective of an elected official, that's a major drawback in terms of transparency. I'd like to know, at least generally, I'd like citizens to know generally where I stand on some of these issues. And I think with the amount of interest on this topic, I think that's important for accountability. And the last point about why this is timely, the work session is 3 weeks away, and 3 weeks of time is not nothing. I mean, we've had a new council elected in May. 3 months have gone by. Another month going by. That's 4 months out of a year. That's a long amount of time. So taking advantage of the next few weeks and giving staff direction on what our priorities are, I think is a good thing. So those are some of my general thoughts, and I wonder if anybody else has thoughts on those ideas, and if so, perhaps we can make a motion to direct staff to take a look at these ideas. It's very general, not so specific, taking into account that you've already said maybe the 1 to 200 versus 1 to 250 isn't the best way to go, but perhaps we can direct staff to look at just parking requirements generally.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Councilwoman Patel.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that I agree with Councilman Majdi's sentiment there, and I think that making, initial changes that are thoughtful and address citizen concerns are not, and doing it expeditiously are not mutually exclusive items. And so I think it would be great if we could direct staff on maybe a timeline, and we'll discuss this further in the work session, but I do think that there has to be some forward movement at this point.
So, thank you, Councilwoman Patel. So I would say, I guess my thought here is there was ideas brought forward as a directive, and those items are things that will be looked at the code review and update if that were to be done. And as Ms. Petcack said, do we want to do this holistically, or do we want to do it piecemeal? Because that's how we've been doing it for a while, 50 years to be exact. We've been making changes here, one off there. And so the question is do we want to direct staff to start continuing that process and looking at it piecemeal here and there, or to move forward with the zoning code, chapter 17 and 18, review and update, and look at it holistically, and all of the things that were mentioned, streetscape, landscape, parking, all of those things, the MAC, will all be looked at that time. So that is the question. I appreciate Councilman Noble's comments, because I do think, yes, I'd like to see the MAC changes. We were on that process of doing the visual design guidelines and the code updates, and the code changes to the MAC. But if we also are going to look at that again in, let's call it, 18 months or less, are we going to do those things now and then do them again? Is that repetitive, and are we really being the most productive and efficient with our time and energy? So that's my only concern, and it's not to not address all of the things, because I think all of these things are important to address. Certainly parking, certainly streetscape, certainly the zoning code, certainly the MAC, signs, lighting. And I know, because of knowing that this code review and update was happening, there were things that council has brought up and staff has brought up that they kind of kept a list of to say, hey, these are things we want to make sure we review at that time. So I think it's just something to think about. Are we going to continue the piecemeal approach, or do we want to look at it holistically or not? So that's just something to think about. Councilman Noble.
Madam Mayor, a quick kind of follow-up on this is that, I'm aware of at least 4, maybe 5 different lists of items that have been talked about. We had a list we did 2-3 years ago as a council body, which had a number of items all across the board, from streetscape to chickens, in terms of priority, okay? We have items that came out of the MAC steering committee was originally done, of things that need to be done going forward, out of the ad hoc committee for MAC of things that need to be done going forward, from the council and planning commission of things. And I think that it doesn't do all of us a service, especially our two new members, where there's this context of this whole portfolio of ideas that's out there, that these three items have primacy. I think we need to have a conversation that is supported by the process we're going to establish that initiates with the review of the code. And get all of the items on the table with professional experts in the field. There are a lot of moving parts in this, and just to say these three things are the most important right now, when staff already knows they're on the list, I guess I'm not enough of a politician, because they're already doing this. Why are we stepping on them? Let them be the professionals in the field that they're supposed to be practicing in, with the delegated authority that we've given them under Mr. Payton and the comprehensive plan.
Councilman Colbert, and then,
Well, you kind of took the words right out of my mouth. I just certainly was going to say that I respect our director's opinion, and I think, this is her field. This is what she does. She makes excellent points. I think she's done this before, and I think we have to let her lead us in this. I mean, certainly we're all going to have our opinions. But she needs to be the leader. I mean, we're not the leaders. I'm not an expert. I don't think anybody at this table except for her is. I think we all have our strengths and weaknesses, but I really just believe we've got to let her lead us through this. And I appreciate everybody wanting to get this done, but it is such a big process and so important that I don't want to rush it either. Thanks.
thank you. Councilman Potter?
Yes, I'm not sure how the doubting or not trusting the staff has anything to do with this conversation. I think it's bringing something into it that's totally unnecessary. That's not being done. We look to you for your guidance. But we also have to understand that a difference of opinion is not an attack. And we've got to get that into our paradigm, and it's not in it right now. I don't know how subdivisions even got into this when we had a very specific direction that we were going to work on MAC and get it settled. Subdivisions have nothing to do with density, which is one of the biggest things that came up. It has nothing to do with heights. It has nothing to do with attracting businesses. It has nothing to do at the same level of influence as making Maple Avenue a successful, pedestrian-friendly place that people want to come and visit. We have diverted the topic, and I don't understand why. I'm anxious to hear what Ms. Petkat has to say on the 9th. I think that would be a very good dialogue. I think, as Councilmember Majdi said, that this proposal that he put out was just a beginning, and it's open for discussion. But we can't keep watching the ball move around and around and around and around. And we're looking at an elephant. And we'll go back to a well-used phrase, and that is, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. We're not eating it one bite at a time. We're throwing it all in together, and we're going to end up with indigestion instead of something that had some focus. The focus is being diverted, in my opinion. And I think we should avoid that. And that's why I think we should stick to the original plan, not compare apples and oranges and end up with fruit salad. Come up with something that is focused and solves that problem. If there are differences that are identified in the MAC reform process, I'll say again, we should note those and compare them to the other regulations if they apply. And in many cases, they don't apply. If you look at Mac and you say, all right, who is going to be an abutting neighbor? Or what is the distance going to be from the corner of something to the building that's going to be built? If that needs to be changed, then change it. And if by doing that, you have to go back to what's in a subdivision and find a better answer, that's great. But to go through it and just hit this and compare this to that and this to that, it's going to take forever. And we don't have forever. And to use the example that Ms. Pecca mentioned, that in terms of putting budgets together, budgets put their individual divisions or groups put their own, or departments put their own budgets together, and then they do comparisons. We're saying, let's get everybody in a room and determine each other's budgets. And to me, that makes no logical sense. So, again, I'm going to be very interested in what you have to say on the 9th. But and to use your other example of the ratio of parking, I agree with you. I'm against anything that reduces parking for businesses. I'm not as concerned about subdivisions, and I don't think that has a significant impact in comparison to what we're looking at with the MAC. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Petcock, do you want to respond to any of that?
I look forward to the 9th.
Okay. Councilwoman Colbert?
Thank you. I respectfully disagree a little bit about that, about the budget. When we have done the budget before, yes, each department comes in, but there are interplays going on, depending on positions, depending on a lot of things. We don't look at it as just each department. And so I don't think that's actually a good comparison. And just once again, I mean, subdivision's very important. I just had a subdivision built behind my house, and we had some neighbors, my neighbors were not happy about certain things, and the code was, it definitely needs to be looked at. I will say that. And I have many people talking to me about different things in the code that are in Chapter 17 and 18. I don't think we want to prioritize because there are a lot of citizens that are concerned about a lot of things in those two chapters. Thank you.
Town Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the Town Council. Councilmember Majdi asked a question, I think, of staff, maybe Planning and Zoning Director, regarding the ideas that he brought forward some time ago. And I just wanted to specifically respond to that and say that, as I understand it, every idea that has been advanced regarding the MAC, including yours, and has been advanced by everyone as part of this process over, I guess, the last couple of months or so, have been collected and will be reviewed holistically. So there's no idea that that was put together, advanced, sent in. We had a number of meetings here and work sessions. All those ideas, I think, would be looked at holistically. So I just wanted to reassure you and all council members that everything that was advanced would be considered. I'd also like to consider a possible thought, and I'm not a planner, so I certainly defer to the Director of Planning and Zoning, and respectfully support her suggestion to do the code altogether. I'm wondering, though, just asking the question of the director, is there a both-and that could be achieved with regard to looking at the entire code? So we have a directive from the council to move forward on the zoning code rewrite. I mean, that's been approved in the budget. It's been so we have that directive, and we also have a directive with the moratorium on the MAC that has a date coming up in a few months. So they're like converging directives from the council. And so I'm wondering if it is possible, maybe it's not, but I'm wondering if it's possible to go forward with the entire zoning code rewrite, and then within that process, the aspects of the MAC being looked at simultaneously I'm wondering if there's a both and in some of the pieces that some of the council members are concerned with that are of high importance. Can there be a both and approach? I'm just asking the question.
But that is what staff is proposing, is that we take all the work that we've done, and we've done quite a bit of work, and look at going forward, do we want to continue to have the MAC as part of the zoning update? Is the MAC the best vehicle to achieve, back to Councilmember Noble's comment, the vision for Maple Avenue? This isn't about the MAC, it's about Maple Avenue. So is that instrument, the Maple Avenue commercial zone, the opt-in zone district, the best way to achieve that vision, or is there something else? The other thing that we've talked about, I mean, we don't have the landscaping standards that, all the provisions in the MAC, the only place they exist is in the MAC. We don't have them for our other commercial zones. So we want to have landscaping standards and lighting standards that apply across the board to all commercial zone districts. You had talked about, Councilmember Maggi, about streetscape. I just want to clarify two things. There's streetscape within the right-of-way, and then there's zoning applies to private property. So outside of the right-of-way, if we are interested in seeing the building setback that we require right now in the MAC to other by-right development, there's different approaches we can take to that. So there's a provision in a form-based code called a build-to zone, which is different than a setback. A setback in a front yard setback for zoning says your building has to be set back X number of feet from the right-of-way. It can go beyond that. So you have a 10-foot setback, your building can be set back 10 feet, or it can be set back 50 feet, which we have with a lot of our strip centers. In a build-to zone, if you apply a build-to zone provision to the commercial zones, you could say the front face of your building has to be built within 10 feet and 20 feet. And that could help us to achieve that continuous open space, that streetscape, the outdoor dining adjacent to the public right-of-way that is desired for Maple Avenue. But again, these are concepts that are new to Vienna that I would like to have comprehensive conversation about it. And well, I have worked on 2 zoning updates in my career. It is a huge lift, and there are a lot of things that I think staff can do in-house. This is not one of those, and we have tried here in the town to tackle the zoning code for years, and it takes time, and we just keep scratching at the surface, one little section at a time. And again, it's an interrelated code. Every section relates to another part of the code. So the benefit and kind of taking the step back, having the comprehensive approach, having consultants come in where this is all they do is code rewrites, and understanding and having experience working in Virginia, because Virginia is very unique to other states because we are a Dillon Rule state. It is a lot of work, but it is doable, and it'll be a lot of work for staff, even hiring a consultant team to do this, but it is long overdue. And if it is the council's desire to, work on the MAC or work on parking or whatever, we can do that. It just puts off the time to do the zoning rewrite, the overhaul that is so needed. But, I mean, we'll do whatever the council directs us to do.
Yeah, Councilman Majdi.
I think we've heard a lot of good ideas. I don't think I've heard a single idea that I didn't like. A lot of great ideas out there. I do think that the council needs to speak as to what our priorities are. So what I'd like to do is just offer a motion now that speaks to that, but then, hear if there are potential amendments to that to modify it to allow for Director Petcack to get at some of these different approaches that she just mentioned. So I'll read it slowly because there was no draft amendment in the staff recommended agenda. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read slowly. I move to direct town staff to draft amendments to the MAC as its top priority and simultaneously to consider amendments to the regular commercial code, C1, C1A, C1B, and C2 in Chapter 18 of the Town Code that affect the MAC. I further move to direct staff to draft amendments to the regular commercial code that require the MAC streetscape, require landscaping for parking lots, and direct staff to consider changes to parking requirements or other incentives to encourage economic growth on Maple Avenue when drafting these amendments. And motion.
Second.
And then one thought that I had is, I just wanted to, as a commentary, I just wanted to make sure that that allows you the opportunity, Director Petcack, to include these other approaches that you were just mentioning that incentivize, encourage, or allow development on Maple Avenue. I think that it does as written, but if other people have ideas on how to make sure that that's explicit, I'm all ears.
So there's been a motion, and it's been seconded.
Can I ask a clarification?
Councilman Noble.
This is actually for Ms. Petcack. Would the motion as read allow you to do what you need to do to update with the RFP you're planning on issuing to update the code? Because the code is more than just our commercial zone.
Correct.
It's our subdivisions, irrespective of what other folks have said here.
Correct.
Does a motion like this that establishes a level of priority materially affect the contracting and timeline that you would have to follow?
I will say
You don't
that.
have to have to that, I mean, I'd prefer an answer tonight, but if that's a
Yeah.
conversation for next week, that's
I-
fine too.
I need to have a conversation with the town manager and the finance director.
So Councilman Noble, I would say that not including the industrial zone, not including CMP, which is down by Navy Federal Credit Union, I think not looking at other zones comprehensively doesn't make sense, because if we change parking in some of those areas, it will affect others.
I also
Councilman
agree.
Noble.
I also agree in the context, Madam Mayor, of a number of the transitional uses that have been proposed, actually by Councilor Majdi, are not commercial. And if this is passed as written, we're missing the point that this is about Maple Avenue, which isn't just commercial per se, especially if we're talking about transitional uses that are adjacent. So, I mean, since the motion's been read and seconded, I'll provide I've stated my opinion previously in this conversation. I think it is a fundamentally flawed approach. And I think bringing in a specialty consultant to advise us on these complex issues is hiring the elephant trainer, to borrow the analogy that Councilman Potter used. And it's high time we hired that person and that firm to do that work. So in the context of this motion, I will be voting against it because I do not believe that at this point we can establish primacy of any one of the three items that Councilor Majdi's added to this because of the other relative value of the other moving parts in this conversation. And we need to provide our staff leadership the ability and the opportunity to bring us best professional practice in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Noble. So I would also say that I think, obviously, I have supported the Maple Avenue vision before. I think the idea of moving forward and making changes is something that was the reason for the moratorium, to make it better and to make it so it's very viable for our commercial. But I think we're at a point right now, based on some of the changes we want to make. I also think the visual design guidelines are important. That's something that I think will help instruct the code that we have to have better visuals and things to hand to people. And it's not just in the C1 or C2. It could also be, as we now see with the police station, it also could be in the transitional, in the CMP or industrial zones as well. So I just think that looking at this. I think it's really important that we look at it holistically. I think Ms. Petcack has laid out, because I was one who really wanted to see it move forward, more have the MAC and the visual design guidelines. But I also think at this point in time, the best use, the most productive use and efficient use of our time is to move forward holistically on the code review and update. So I appreciate the things brought forward. I think that's part of it, but I think we're also then missing lighting and signs and design standards and all of those other things. So that's my, Mr. DeFury, you've had your hand raised. Do you want to add something? Yep. This is not a public hearing, but you've waited this long.
But this is, normally council takes input from citizens. There had been no citizens here talking. You all have been doing a wonderful job of talking. First thing, do no harm. That should be the first thing that you all are concerned about. I'm a former Army guy. There are some principles of war that apply here. One, unity of effort. I've listened to Ms. Petcack. She's out of the Field Manual 101 on how to do staff work and do staff work right. Councilman Noble has endorsed what she's doing. You're paying folks good bucks to provide you input. And if you can hire people that are consultants, that know their business, because I was a consultant and I knew what I was talking about, it's going to pay you dividends in the future. Economy of scale. You don't want to be all over the ballpark. You want to know exactly what you got to defend against, what you got to go for. And that's another principle of war. And you don't want to have a piecemeal solution. You don't want to bring your extra brigade in to fight the enemy after you've lost the main attack because it wasn't big enough. And that's what, when you separate this out, you're approaching it piecemeal. And there are a lot of moving parts, as has been mentioned. There are second and third order impacts that we don't know about. And I'm pretty sure that we don't have the automation in place to help us see those. Maybe we do, but I haven't seen it yet. And, okay. There was concern about people having monetary impacts. Well, I think 440 Maple Avenue was sold a heck of a long time ago. I've been hearing about new thing coming in there, and that the Taco Grande was going to close. It's still open. And we've approved that project a year or so ago. I don't know that they've broken any ground, but the last time I went that way, they haven't. So, somebody buys a piece of property. I understand Giant was sold. They'll hold it. It's not going to go down unless we have a 2007 again. So I wouldn't worry about them. The original plan was to do this code in two-year interval. You paid for 1 year. You got another year coming up. You're going to have to discuss that to pay it again for 18, 19, 20, 21, or whatever it is.
We've already paid. We've already.
You paid for both years?
Yeah, we have both now.
Okay, well, so, if you paid for it, you better take advantage of it and use it well. You've got transportation study. I'm interested to see what comes out of that thing in September. There's a lot of stuff coming up. So sometime between now and November, you're all going to have to decide whether you're going to extend the moratorium. And from what I'm hearing tonight, I think the answer is yeah, you got to extend it. So let's not dither about it. Do it. Okay. This thing you're going to vote on now, it's basically what we call in the military teaching people how to suck eggs. You don't want to teach somebody how to suck eggs. She's a professional. She's got a professional staff. You've got a professional staff. Don't try to hamstring them by telling them what to do and give them chapter and verse. Because what you're going to do is you're going to get a crummy product. It always happens that way. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Okay.
There you go.
Councilman Majdi.
Yeah, I mentioned a few times, it sounds like there's a lot of common ground. I also think that we've identified some sharp differences. For me, I'm not interested in looking at residential subdivisions right now. I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I don't think I'm not interested in looking at that right now. I'm not interested in looking at changes to the technology park, i.e. Navy Federal right now. I'm not interested in looking at industrial zone changes right now. I think we've got a lot of work to do already, and certainly we'll be discussing related topics on September 9th. But, sometimes you do have differences of opinion.
Okay, so it's been moved and seconded. Any other discussion? Madam Clerk, please poll the council.
Councilwoman Colbert,
Nay?
Councilman Majdi,
Aye.
Councilman Noble,
Nay.
Councilwoman Patel,
Aye.
Councilman Potter,
Aye.
Councilman Springsteen.
Aye.
Mayor DeRocco.
Nay. That motion passes. Next item of business.